On a small island in the Indonesian archipelago, surrounded by deep ocean on every side, another kind of human being survived for hundreds of thousands of years. They stood barely 3.5 feet tall. Their brains were about the size of a closed fist. And yet, in the limestone caves of Flores, they made tools. They processed animals with careful hands. They returned to the same shelter again and again, across a span of time, so long it makes recorded history feel brief. They were not myths. They were not apes. They were human beings, shaped by one isolated island for hundreds of thousands of years. Evolution made them smaller because the island rewarded smaller bodies. Less food, fewer predators, limited space. Across generations, the population changed until it became something the world had never seen before. And then, around 50,000 years ago, right as Homo sapiens were moving through this region of the world, they disappeared. Gone from the record. Completely. As far as we can tell, the cave is still there. The bones are still there. And the question of what happened has never been fully answered. Tonight, we go to Flores Island, to a cave above a river valley, to the remains of a people who survived on one isolated island for longer than our own species has existed. Settle in. Let your breathing slow. We have time. Chapter 1. The Island That Makes Things Small. There is a principle in biology that sounds, the first time you hear it, like something from a story rather than a science. It is called island dwarfism, and what it describes is real. Documented across dozens of species, on dozens of islands, across hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history. The principle is this. When a large animal becomes isolated on an island, cut off from the mainland by water it cannot cross, something begins to happen over generations. The animal gets smaller, not in a single lifetime, not in a way any individual would notice, but across thousands of generations, across vast stretches of time. The population drifts downward in body size until it occupies a form that the mainland version of the same species would not recognize. The reasons are not mysterious. Once you understand the logic of what an island actually is, an island is a closed system. The resources it contains, the plants, the animals, the water, the calories available in any given season, are finite in a way that a continent is not. On a continent, a large animal facing a bad year can move. It can follow the rainfall, track the herds, push into new territory when the old territory fails. On an island, there's nowhere to go. The ocean stops that option at every edge. In a closed system with finite resources, a smaller body is a more efficient machine. It requires fewer calories to maintain. It can survive a bad season on what a larger body would consider inadequate. It reproduces successfully at lower resource levels. Over enough generations. In a population where smaller individuals consistently outlast and outreproduce larger ones, the average size of the population drifts down, not by design, not by intention, by the simple, patient arithmetic of which bodies leave more descendants. This has happened independently on islands across the world. In every geological era where islands existed and animals found their way to them, the Mediterranean produced dwarf elephants. Islands off the coast of California produced dwarf mammoths. The Channel Islands of Britain have yielded the bones of animals dramatically smaller than their mainland relatives. In every case, the logic is the same. The island is a pressure. The pressure shapes the population. Time does the rest. Flores is a volcanic island in the Indonesian archipelago. Roughly 360 miles long and between 30 and 60 miles wide, depending on where you measure. It sits in a chain of islands that stretches east from Java toward the island of Timor. In a region where the sea floor drops into some of the deepest ocean trenches in the world, the Wallace Line. the biogeographical boundary identified by the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace in the 19th century that separates the fauna of Asia from the fauna of Australasia, runs just to the west of Flores. West of that line, the islands were connected to the Asian mainland during periods of low sea level in the ice ages. East of it, including Flores, the deep water trenches meant the islands were never connected. They were always islands, always separated by open ocean from the populations of animals on the mainland. This matters enormously for understanding what happened on Flores, because an island that was never connected to the mainland is an island that could only be reached by crossing open water. Every species that arrived on Flores got there by accident, or by a crossing that should, by most reasonable assessments of probability, have failed. Floating debris, accidental rafting, a storm that pushed a group of animals further than any storm had any right to push them. The animals that won that lottery on Flores were then subject to everything the island could do to them. Flores had elephants once. Not the full-sized Asian elephants of the mainland, but stegodon, an ancient proboscidean that reached the island and then, across hundreds of thousands of years of isolation, became something smaller. The stegodon florensis that the island's hominin inhabitants would eventually share territory with was not the size of an Asian elephant. It was closer to the size of a large water buffalo. The reduction was real, documented in the fossil record, a measurable consequence of the same pressure that would act on the hominins who found their way to the same island. Flores also had giant rats, rodents, the size of rabbits or small dogs. Because, on islands where large predators are absent, the pressure that keeps small animals small on the mainland is reduced. Island gigantism is the mirror image of island dwarfism, and both are documented on Flores. The island produced giants and dwarfs simultaneously, each shaped by the specific pressures acting on their specific niche. It produced something else, too. Sometime around 1 million years ago, based on the oldest stone tools yet found on the island, a hominin population arrived on Flores. Not Homo sapiens. Our species would not exist for hundreds of thousands of years after this first crossing. The population that arrived was something older, likely related to Homo erectus or to an even earlier hominin lineage, though the precise ancestral relationship remains debated among researchers. A group of them, by some mechanism that is still not fully understood, crossed the deep water between islands and reached Flores. And then the island went to work on them. For hundreds of thousands of years, that isolated population was shaped by the same logic that had shaped every other large animal that had arrived before them. The resources were finite. The island was closed. A smaller body was a more efficient body, and generation by generation, the population drifted towards something that their distant ancestors would not have recognized as kin. They became Homo floresiensis. They became something that had never existed before and would never exist again. Not a failed version of something else. Not a diminished copy of a more successful template. A genuine product of a specific pressure in a specific place. A kind of human being shaped entirely by the logic of one island. One closed system, one set of forces that no other population on Earth had experienced in exactly that way. Consider what that span of time actually means. The oldest known writing in the world is roughly 5,000 years old. The distance between the first hominin arrival on Flores and the present moment is 200 times that span. If you compressed the entire period of recorded human history into a single day, the time that the ancestors of Homo floresiensis spent isolated on that island would be more than 7 months. 7 months of a day in which we do not appear at all. They were there, changing slowly, becoming something new, living and dying in the limestone caves and the river valleys and the volcanic forests of that island, for a span of time that makes everything we call history look like a footnote at the very end of a very long story. The island made them. It made them into something genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably themselves. And then, as far as the record shows, they were gone. The question of what ended them, and whether we had anything to do with it, is the question this story is moving toward. But before we can ask it honestly, we need to understand who they actually were. Not the popular image, not the headline, not the word hobbit, which researchers who have spent their careers studying these remains generally find reductive in ways worth understanding. The actual evidence, the bones and the tools and the sediment layers and the structure of a brain case that was unlike anything the fossil record had produced before. That evidence is waiting in the caves of Flores. The caves are patient. They have been holding what they know for 50,000 years. We can take our time getting there. Chapter 2. 1 million years of isolation. Picture the Indonesian archipelago from above. Not the modern map with its country borders and shipping lanes and the names of cities printed across islands the size of continents. The older version. The version from close to 1 million years ago. When the sea levels were lower and the shallow shelves between islands were exposed as dry land, and the geography of the region looked significantly different from what any modern atlas would show you. To the west, the large islands of Java and Sumatra were connected to the Asian mainland. A land bridge, broad and forested and crossed by animals moving east across a landscape that offered no obvious reason to stop. Elephants, deer, pigs, and hominins, the upright walking descendants of African ancestors who had been spreading across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before this moment. Moving through that landscape, the way large-brained social animals move through any landscape they find habitable, following water, following prey, learning the terrain generation by generation and passing that knowledge forward. East of Java, the geography changed. The Wallace Line is not visible on the surface of the water. There is no marker, no change in the color of the sea, no physical boundary that an animal crossing from the western islands to the eastern ones would perceive as a threshold. But the deep water trenches on the eastern side of that line meant that even during the lowest sea levels of the ice ages, the islands to the east remained islands. They were never connected to the mainland. They were always separated by open ocean that had to be crossed, not walked around. Lombok, Sumbawa, Flores, each one separated from its neighbors by channels of deep water that the largest ice age sea level drops were not sufficient to bridge. This is the first mystery of Homo floresiensis. Not what they became, but how they got there. Because something did get there. Stone tools found at the site of Wolo Sege on Flores, reported by a research team led by Adam Brum of Griffith University and published in the journal Nature in 2010, have been dated to approximately 1 million years ago, 1 million years before the present. Something capable of making stone tools was present on an island that required an open water crossing to reach. Whether that population was already on the path toward the small-bodied form we know as Homo floresiensis, or whether the size reduction came later across subsequent generations on the island, is a question the fossil record does not yet fully resolve. What the tools establish is presence. Something was there. Something crossed. What that crossing looked like is a question the evidence cannot fully answer. No boat technology is documented anywhere in the world at this period. No deliberate watercraft. And yet, something crossed. The most commonly discussed hypothesis involves accidental rafting. A group of hominins near the coast of a neighboring island, caught by a storm surge or a flooding river, carried out to sea on a mass of floating vegetation. Most such accidents end in drowning. The odds against any specific crossing succeeding are very high. But the odds against it ever happening across such a vast span of time are much lower. Given enough centuries, given enough storms, given enough groups living near enough to the water, the improbable becomes, eventually, possible. A second hypothesis involves tsunamis. The Indonesian region is one of the most seismically active on Earth, and a tsunami of sufficient scale could theoretically carry debris extraordinary distances in less time than it would take the people on it to understand what was happening. Either way, the crossing was almost certainly not a choice. It was an accident that happened to succeed. A group of individuals found themselves on a new piece of land surrounded by deep water with no way back, and the island received them. What happened next is a story measured in geological time. The founding population was now subject to the logic of island evolution. Cut off from the mainland, unable to receive new genetic material from outside, responding, generation by generation, to the specific pressures of a closed system with finite resources. Fossil remains discovered at the site of Mata Menge in the Soa Basin of Flores. Described by Gerrit van den Berg and colleagues in Nature in 2016, and dated to approximately 700,000 years ago, include fragmentary dental and jaw material showing characteristics consistent with small body size. The Mata Menge material is fragmentary, and researchers are careful about the limits of what such fragments can establish. But the evidence points toward a population on Flores that had been changing across a very long time. Now consider what hundreds of thousands of years of isolation actually means, not just for a body, for mind. Imagine a single morning. A hominin walks out of a limestone cave into the early light of a tropical island. The river below catches the sun. The volcanic peaks to the east are already gathering cloud. The forest is loud, with birds whose calls this person has heard every morning of their life, whose patterns of sound they have learned to read the way you learn to read a language. That morning happened, not once, tens of millions of times across hundreds of thousands of years. The same cave, the same river, the same peaks, different people, generation after generation, carrying forward what the ones before them had learned about this specific place. A population cut off from all contact with other groups develops along its own internal logic. The knowledge it accumulates is the knowledge it generates itself, passed forward through its own chain of transmission, refined by its own experience of its own specific environment. Every technique Homo floresiensis developed for working stone, they developed themselves. Every understanding they had of the animals they shared the island with, they arrived at through direct experience across generations of living alongside those animals. Every piece of knowledge about the caves, the rivers, the volcanic landscape, the seasonal patterns of rainfall and fruiting and animal movement, was local knowledge, built up across an extraordinary span of time by people who had nowhere else to go and nothing to compare their world to. This is not a limitation, it is a depth. Hundreds of thousands of years of paying attention to one place produces a kind of knowledge about that place that no amount of wider ranging can replicate. The Homo floresiensis, who walked out of Liangbua Cave 50,000 years before the present, knew Flores the way nothing else, alive, knew it. They knew it the way you can only know something you have depended on for your entire existence. And your parents' existence. And their parents' existence. Going back further than memory can reach. That knowledge was not written down. It lived in the practices and the habits and the learned responses of a small population on a small island. Transmitted from older to younger through observation and demonstration and whatever form of communication they were capable of. When they were gone, that knowledge was gone with them. Not archived, not transmitted, not preserved in any form that the world that came after could access. Simply gone. The isolation that made them also made what they knew unrepeatable. There is no other version of that accumulated understanding of that specific island. It existed once, in them, and it ended when they ended. But before we reach the ending, we need to understand what hundreds of thousands of years of isolation produced, not just in their bodies, which the bones can tell us about directly, but in their behavior, their technology, their capacity to engage with the world they lived in. Because the question that would define how the scientific community received the discovery of Homo floresiensis and would shape every subsequent debate about their extinction was not about their size. It was about their minds. A 3.5-foot-tall human with a brain the size of a closed fist, an island that had been reshaping them across an immense span of time, a cave full of stone tools and animal bones and sediment layers that preserved the traces of occupation. What kind of mind made those tools? The company and debilitation. What kind of mind? Those questions were waiting in the sediments of Liang Bua Cave for a long time before anyone arrived to ask them. Chapter 3. The Find That Broke the Textbooks. In September of 2003, in a limestone cave on the western end of Flores Island, a researcher named Peter Brown was looking at a collection of bones that did not make sense. The bones had been excavated from a deposit roughly 6 meters below the present surface of the cave floor, in sediments that preliminary dating suggested were tens of thousands of years old. They had been found by a team led by the Australian archaeologist Mike Morwood, working in collaboration with the Indonesian archaeologist Radian Sojono and their colleagues from the National Research Center for Archaeology in Jakarta. Brown was a paleoanthropologist at the University of New England in Australia. Morwood had brought him the bones because the bones required someone with exactly that expertise. Because the bones were not behaving the way bones from that time period in that part of the world were supposed to behave, the skeleton, designated LB1 for Liang Bua Individual Number 1, was nearly complete by the standards of the fossil record. There was a skull. There was a lower jaw. There were leg bones, arm bones, hand bones, foot bones, enough to reconstruct, with care and attention, the basic form of the individual who had left them in the sediment of that cave. The individual was an adult. The teeth were fully erupted and worn in the way adult teeth wear with years of use. The long bones were fused at the growth plates in the way that indicates skeletal maturity. Brown knew this before he knew almost anything else about the skeleton. This was not a child. This was not an adolescent. This was a fully grown adult human being who stood roughly 3.5 feet tall. Sit with that for a moment. Not a specimen. A person. Someone who had woken up in this cave or near it. Who had moved through the landscape of western Flores. Who had eaten and slept and known other people. Who had carried knowledge about this island, in their mind, the way you carry knowledge about the place you grew up in. Someone whose teeth had worn down over the years of a life lived fully. Someone whose brain, estimated from the internal volume of the skull, measured approximately 420 cubic centimeters, less than a third the size of the brain you are using right now to hear these words. This person had died. Their bones had lain in the sediment of that cave for tens of thousands of years. And then Peter Brown was looking at them on a table, and understanding, in the way that a career of careful scientific work prepares you to understand things you have never encountered before, that what he was looking at was going to change everything. The paper describing LB1 was published in the journal Nature in October of 2004. The authors named a new species, Homo floresiensis, a new member of the genus Homo, previously unknown to science, recovered from a cave on a small Indonesian island. The reaction was immediate and global, and in significant part. It was disbelief. Not the polite scientific skepticism that is the ordinary currency of academic debate. Genuine disbelief, the kind that produces not careful methodological objections, but a visceral resistance to the conclusion itself. Because the conclusion was too strange. It violated too many things that researchers had come to assume about how the human lineage worked, about what was possible in that period of human evolutionary history, about what kinds of beings had and had not been sharing the planet with our own species in the relatively recent past. The most persistent alternative explanation, argued most forcefully by the Indonesian paleoanthropologist Tuku Jacob, was that LB1 was not a new species at all, that it was a modern human who had suffered from a pathological condition causing microcephaly, an abnormally small brain and skull, combined with other developmental abnormalities accounting for the small body size. In this interpretation, what the Liang Bua team had found was not a new species, but a sick individual from a known one. Jacob's position was argued loudly and publicly. The scientific debate that followed was, by the standards of academic paleontology, unusually heated. Jacob temporarily took custody of some of the original fossils, a decision that Morwood and his colleagues protested strongly. The dispute became as much about the politics of access to fossils and the authority to interpret them as it was about the scientific questions themselves. But the evidence did not cooperate with the pathology hypothesis. The critical problem was that LB1 was not alone. As excavations at Liang Bua continued in subsequent years, more remains were recovered. Teeth, arm bones, leg bones, jaw fragments, the remains of at least 9 additional individuals, all showing the same pattern of small body size. A pathology that affects one person does not affect an entire population in the same way across a substantial period of time. Detailed analysis of the skeleton of LB1 found features inconsistent with Homo sapiens of any body size. The shape of the wrist bones was different. The shape of the shoulder was different. The proportions of the limbs reflected not just size reduction, but a fundamentally different underlying body plan. These were not the proportions of a small Homo sapiens. They were the proportions of a hominin with a different evolutionary history, one that reached back much further than our species does. A study published in the journal Nature in 2009, led by William Jungers of Stony Brook University, analyzed the foot bones of Homo floresiensis in detail and found features more consistent with earlier hominins than with Homo sapiens. The foot was not a small version of a modern human foot. It was a different kind of foot, carrying traces of an evolutionary history that diverged from the lineage leading to modern humans much earlier than any island dwarfism scenario involving Homo sapiens could account for. Ancient DNA analysis, which might have resolved many of these questions definitively, has not yet been successfully extracted from the Flores remains. The tropical environment of Indonesia is hostile to DNA preservation. Every attempt to recover genetic material from the Liang Bua fossils has so far failed to produce a usable sequence. This is one of the most significant absences in the current understanding of Homo floresiensis, and it leaves a range of questions that morphological evidence alone cannot fully settle. What the morphological evidence does support, and what the majority of researchers working in this field have concluded, based on accumulated analysis across 2 decades of study, is that Homo floresiensis was a genuine species, not a pathological population of modern humans, a distinct hominin lineage with deep evolutionary roots, shaped across hundreds of thousands of years of island isolation into something that the human family tree, as understood before 2004, had no category for. The textbooks were not simply updated, they were restructured. Because the discovery of Homo floresiensis did not just add a species to a list, it demonstrated that a small island in the Indonesian archipelago, far from the regions where most of the major discoveries in human paleontology had been made, could contain a chapter of the human story that no one had suspected existed. And it raised a question that the discovery itself could not answer. If Homo floresiensis was real, if they were a genuine species that had persisted on that island for hundreds of thousands of years and had still been present as recently as 50,000 years ago, then what had happened to them? The answer, or rather, the set of competing partial answers that represent the current state of scientific understanding, requires first understanding what Homo floresiensis was actually capable of, because the question of what ended them is inseparable from the question of what they were, and what they were. The evidence from the cave suggests was considerably more than the size of their brains would lead any simple assumption to predict. The cave held more than bones. It always does. Chapter 4. Small brain. Sharp mind. There is an assumption so deeply embedded in the way modern humans think about intelligence that most people never notice they are making it. The assumption is this: bigger brain means smarter. More brain volume means more cognitive capacity. The size of the organ is a reasonable proxy for the power of the mind it produces. It is an assumption that feels intuitive. It maps onto things we observe in the living world. Elephants and dolphins and chimpanzees. Animals we recognize as cognitively sophisticated have large brains relative to their body size. The correlation seems real and the inference seems reasonable. The problem is that when you apply this assumption to Homo floresiensis, it produces a conclusion that the evidence from Liangbua Cave does not straightforwardly support. Begin with the stone tools. Liangbua Cave has yielded thousands of stone artifacts from the layers associated with Homo floresiensis occupation. The assemblage includes flakes, cores, points, and blades, produced by a technique called prepared core reduction, in which the toolmaker shapes a stone nodule in advance to control the size and form of the flakes that will be struck from it. This is not the simplest form of stone tool production. It requires planning. It requires the ability to hold in mind a desired end product and to work backward from that product through the sequence of steps needed to produce it. Research on the Liangbua stone tool assemblage, including work published by Adam Brum and his colleagues at Griffith University, has found that the tools show evidence of being made from raw material sourced at locations not immediately adjacent to the site. The tool makers appear to have been selecting specific types of stone and carrying them distances that required forward planning and intentional selection. A brain, a third the size of yours, was doing this. The question of how is one that researchers have approached from multiple angles. Dean Falk of Florida State University led a study of the internal structure of the LB1 brain case, published in the journal Science in 2005, that found organization in areas associated with higher cognitive functions, including regions of the frontal lobes. Falk and her colleagues argued this suggested a brain whose reorganization had preserved or enhanced certain capacities, even as overall volume reduced. This interpretation has been contested. Other researchers examining the same endocast data have offered alternative readings, and the scientific community has not reached consensus on what the internal organization of the Homo floresiensis brain tells us about its cognitive capacity. Endocast analysis has real limits, and researchers who work most carefully in this field acknowledge those limits explicitly. What the endocast evidence contributes is a suggestion, not a conclusion, that the reduction in brain volume did not uniformly reduce all cognitive functions equally. What is less contested is the behavioral evidence from the cave itself. The bones of Stegodon florensis insularis, the dwarf elephant species endemic to Flores, appear in the layers associated with Homo floresiensis occupation at Liangbua. Some of these bones bear cut marks consistent with butchering, and some show evidence of burning. Whether these remains reflect active hunting, opportunistic scavenging of animals that died by other means, or some combination that varied by season and circumstance, is a question researchers continue to debate. The association of cut-marked and processed stegodon bones with Homo floresiensis stone tools is established. The precise behavioral relationship between the hominins and these animals remains an open question. What the association does suggest is regular, organized engagement with large animals in a context that required coordinated effort among individuals. Whether that rose to what we would call cooperative hunting in the full sense, or whether it was something more opportunistic. The evidence does not allow us to state definitively. The sediment layers associated with Homo floresiensis occupation at Liangbua also contain charcoal and ash. The interpretation of this burning evidence requires care The 2016 reanalysis of the site by Tochari, Sutikna, and colleagues established that some material previously attributed to Homo floresiensis occupation belonged to stratigraphically later layers associated with subsequent Homo sapiens presence at the site. Researchers have worked carefully to address which burning evidence most securely belongs to Homo floresiensis layers, and the current literature treats this evidence with appropriate caution. Traces of burning are associated with the broader Homo floresiensis occupation record, but the precise nature and extent of any fire use by this species remains a matter of ongoing careful study rather than settled conclusion. The resolution to the brain size question lies partly in the concept of encephalization quotient, the ratio of actual brain size to expected brain size for an animal of a given body mass. When you account for their very small body size, the Homo floresiensis brain is less anomalous than the raw volume figure alone suggests. Their brains were small relative to ours, but not as unusually small relative to their bodies as the absolute volume implies. The deeper resolution lies in a more fundamental challenge to the assumption itself. Brain size and cognitive capacity are correlated across broad categories of animals, but the correlation is not tight enough to be reliably predictive within the primate lineage. The specific organization of neural tissue matters as much as total volume. The density of neural connections, the relative development of specific regions, the efficiency of information processing within a given volume, all contribute to cognitive capacity in ways that raw volume does not capture. What the Liangbua evidence shows, taken together, is a species that was making planned tools, selecting and transporting raw materials, processing large animals, and occupying the same cave site across a substantial period of time. These behaviors are not consistent with a species of severely limited cognitive capacity. They are consistent with a species that had developed, across hundreds of thousands of years of island isolation, a cognitive architecture sufficient for the demands of its specific environment, a smaller machine, differently organized, producing outputs that the size of the machine alone does not predict. There is something in this that resists the easy narrative about intelligence and brain size that modern humans are perhaps too comfortable with. We are a species that tends to measure cognitive worth by the standards most flattering to ourselves. Raw brain volume is one of those metrics. Homo floresiensis scores poorly on it. But the cave does not score them poorly. The cave scores them as survivors, as toolmakers, as occupants of a specific place across a span of time that no cognitive standard we currently apply would have predicted was possible for a brain of that size. The brain the size of a closed fist was, as far as the record shows, enough. For hundreds of thousands of years, it was enough. Chapter 5. Neighbors in the dark. Stand at the mouth of Liangbua Cave in the early morning. The cave opens into the side of a limestone hill in the Manggarai region of western Flores, surrounded by a landscape that is, even now, dramatically alive. The hills are steep and forested. The Wei Reikang River runs below. The air carries the particular humidity of a tropical island where the ocean is never far away and the vegetation responds to every rainfall with an urgency that makes the growth feel almost audible. The cave itself is large. The main chamber is roughly 50 meters across and 30 meters deep, with a ceiling that rises high enough in places that the light from the entrance does not reach it. The floor slopes down from the entrance. And the deeper you go, the older the sediments beneath your feet become. Each layer, a compressed record of everything that happened in and around this place across the thousands of years of its occupation. For the Homo floresiensis who used this cave, it was not a museum. It was not a site. It was home. The most basic and fundamental kind of home. A place with walls on three sides, a ceiling overhead, and a floor that could be returned to season after season across a span of time that makes the entire history of human architecture look recent. A place that accumulated, in its sediments. The quiet evidence of a life organized around coming back. Always coming back. If you are listening to this in the dark tonight, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, you already know something about what that feels like. The return to a familiar place. The way a specific ceiling above you, a specific quality of quiet around you, signals to something deep in the body that you are where you are supposed to be. They had that. In that cave, for hundreds of thousands of years, the cave existed within a landscape, and the landscape was full. Flores, in the period of Homo floresiensis occupation, was not the same island it is today. The vegetation was different. The sea level was lower during glacial periods, shifting the coastline and the distribution of resources. The forests were denser in some areas and more open in others, depending on the volcanic history of the terrain. Because Flores is a volcanically active island, and eruptions periodically reshape the landscape in ways that can be dramatic and sudden. And the animals that shared the island with Homo floresiensis were unlike anything in the modern Indonesian fauna. Begin with Stegodon. The dwarf elephant of Flores was substantially smaller than the mainland Stegodon from which it descended, closer in size to a large domestic cow than to an Asian elephant. They moved through the forests and river valleys of Flores in what the fossil record suggests were small groups, browsing the vegetation and following seasonal water sources. The evidence from Liang Bua shows that Homo floresiensis and Stegodon occupied the same landscape for a very long time. Cut-marked and processed Stegodon bones appear in the layers associated with Homo floresiensis occupation, suggesting regular engagement with these animals across what appears to be a substantial period. That engagement, whether through active hunting, opportunistic processing of carcasses, or some combination that varied by season and circumstance, required knowledge of the animal, its behavior, its movement patterns, its vulnerabilities, knowledge that was not the kind any individual could accumulate in a single lifetime. It was the kind that builds across generations. Each generation adding its observations to the body of practical understanding that the previous ones had left behind. The Komodo dragon was present. Not necessarily the specific species that lives on the adjacent islands today, but a related giant monitor lizard whose fossil remains have been recovered from Flores in deposits contemporaneous with Homo floresiensis occupation. The Komodo dragon is a formidable animal. Adults can reach 3 meters in length. They are ambush predators with serrated teeth and a bite that introduces compounds into wounds, causing prey to weaken over time. They are not deterred by the presence of hominins in their environment. Homo floresiensis shared their island with an animal that would kill and eat them if the opportunity arose. That is worth holding for a moment. Not as a dramatic detail, as a fact about daily life. Every morning that a Homo floresiensis individual walked out of this cave and down toward the river, the awareness of what moved in that landscape was not abstract. It was immediate. It was learned. It was the product of accumulated knowledge about where large monitor lizards were likely to be, and what the signs of their presence looked like in the vegetation along the riverbank. And how close was too close. You do not learn that kind of knowledge from a book. You learn it from someone who learned it from someone who learned it from someone else, going back further than any story can reach. There were giant storks, Leptoptilus robustus, a bird standing roughly 1.5 meters tall, has been identified from fossil remains in deposits associated with the Homo floresiensis occupation period at Liang Bua. There were large eagles. Analysis of bird bone assemblages from Liang Bua and related sites, including work by Hanneke Meyer of the Naturalist Biodiversity Center in Leiden, has documented the presence of large raptors in the Flores fauna of this period. In an ecosystem containing small-bodied hominins, large birds of prey were not an irrelevant feature of the landscape. And then there were the giant rats, rodents the size of small dogs, moving through the same cave systems and forest floors that Homo floresiensis used. Part of the dense, layered, sometimes dangerous ecology of an island that had been running its own evolutionary experiment for a very long time. The world inside and around Liang Bua Cave was not simple. It was a web of relationships, some dangerous, some potentially useful, all requiring a level of situational awareness and accumulated knowledge that the evidence from the cave suggests Homo floresiensis possessed. In whatever form, their specific cognitive architecture allowed. Now consider the ground beneath their feet. Flores is volcanically active, and the stratigraphic record at Liang Bua documents multiple episodes of volcanic ash deposition across the period of hominin occupation. Tephra layers appear at various levels in the sedimentary sequences, marking eruption events that would have affected the local landscape in ways ranging from minor to significant. The presence of occupation evidence above some of these tephra layers indicates that hominin use of the cave continued after at least some documented volcanic events. How they navigated the disrupted landscape in the aftermath of an eruption. Where they went. What they ate when their usual resources were unavailable. How long before they came back. Is something the cave record suggests rather than proves directly. But the survival of the lineage across hundreds of thousands of years on a volcanically active island speaks to a resilience that was not passive. It was earned, tested repeatedly, and, as far as the record shows, repeatedly demonstrated. The world they inhabited was dangerous and strange, and entirely their own. They had made it theirs across a span of time that the mind resists fully holding. They had learned it and been shaped by it and depended on it and returned to it. Season after season, generation after generation. In the way that only a very long history of dependence on one specific place can make a place feel like yours. The cave held them, and for a very long time, as far as the record shows. That was enough. The river ran below. The volcanic mountains rose above. The deep ocean sat on every horizon. The same water that had brought their ancestors here. The same water that had kept them here. The same water that would still be there long after the last of them was gone. But that ending was still ahead. For now, the cave was full of life. The night sounds of Flores were outside. And somewhere in the darkness, the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of thousands of years of one island was held in the minds of the people who called this place home. Not written down anywhere. Just there, alive in them. Chapter 6. Eruptions, Extinctions, and Survival. There is a particular kind of knowledge that only comes from living in a dangerous place for a very long time. Not the knowledge of how to avoid danger. That is available to any creature with functional instincts and a reasonable amount of experience. The deeper knowledge. The knowledge of how to read the landscape before the change arrives. The knowledge of where to go when it does. The knowledge of what comes after. What the world looks like in the months and years following a disruption. Which resources return first and which take longer. Which routes are passable and which have been permanently altered. This is the knowledge that a population accumulates across generations of living in a place that regularly tests them. Flores is one of the most volcanically active islands in one of the most volcanically active regions on Earth. It sits on the Sunda Arc, the chain of volcanic islands produced by the subduction of the Australian tectonic plate beneath the Eurasian plate. A geological process that has been generating eruptions across this region for millions of years and shows no signs of stopping. The islands of Java, Bali, Lombok, Sumbawa, and Flores are all products of this process. And all of them carry active or potentially active volcanic systems. For the population of Homo floresiensis, this was not background information. It was the ground beneath their feet. Literally. The stratigraphic record at Liang Bua Cave documents multiple volcanic events across the period of hominin occupation on the island. Tephra layers, bands of volcanic ash deposited by eruption events, appear at various levels in the sedimentary sequences. Some of these layers are thin, representing distant eruptions whose ash fell across the island without causing immediate local catastrophe. Others are thicker, representing events whose effects on the local landscape would have been more significant. What does a volcanic eruption do to an island ecosystem? The immediate effects are the most visible. Pyroclastic flows incinerate everything in their path. Ash fall coats vegetation and water sources across large areas. The weight of ash accumulation can collapse forest canopy, destroying the habitat of animals that depend on it. For a small-bodied hominin population on an island with no way to leave, a large eruption was not a disaster. You could flee by crossing a border or sailing to a safer mainland. You could move to the parts of the island least affected. You could follow the animals moving away from the most disrupted areas. But you could not leave. The ocean on every side made sure of that. The medium-term effects are in some ways more challenging than the immediate ones. After the initial event, the landscape goes through a recovery process that takes years to decades depending on the scale of the disruption. The food sources that a population has depended on for generations may be unavailable for extended periods. The knowledge that took generations to accumulate about where animals move in a given season, which river reaches hold resources, which areas provide the best raw material for tools. All of that knowledge can become partially obsolete when a significant eruption reshapes the terrain. The survivors have to relearn. With fewer individuals than before. With the specific knowledge of those who did not survive now gone. With a landscape that no longer entirely matches the understanding the group had inherited from its predecessors. And yet, the evidence from Liang Bua suggests that the Homo floresiensis lineage persisted through volcanic disruptions that left measurable ash deposits in the cave sediments. Occupation evidence, in the form of stone tools and faunal remains, appears in deposits above tephra layers, indicating that hominin presence at the site continued after at least some documented volcanic events. The lineage did not stop at the ash. It continued above it. It came back, again and again, as far as the record shows. This persistence tells us something about the resilience of this lineage that their anatomy alone cannot convey. A population that survives repeated volcanic disruptions on an island with no exit is a population that had developed across the generations that preceded each disruption. A sufficient base of knowledge and behavioral flexibility to navigate the aftermath. They knew where to go, or they learned, or the ones who found their way through survived and carried forward what they had learned. And the ones who did not find their way through did not. All three of those mechanisms are probably true in different proportions across different events. What evolution records is the outcome, and the outcome, repeated across multiple volcanic events and across hundreds of thousands of years of occupation on a geologically restless island, was that the lineage persisted on Flores. Now consider the extinction of Stegodon alongside this picture. Stegodon florensis, insularis. The dwarf elephant, whose processed remains appear in association with Homo floresiensis occupation at Liang Bua, disappears from the fossil record at approximately the same time as Homo floresiensis itself, around 50,000 years ago. The concurrent disappearance of both species has been noted by multiple researchers and interpreted in different ways. One interpretation is that both were affected by the same underlying cause, whether environmental disruption, ecological change, or the arrival of new pressures in the regional ecosystem. Another is that the disappearance of Stegodon may have compounded whatever pressures were already acting on Homo floresiensis, by removing a significant resource from their subsistence landscape at a moment when other stresses were also present. Research by Gert van den Berg and colleagues examining the faunal record from Liang Bua and other Flores sites has documented the sequence of animal changes on the island across this period with increasing precision. The picture that emerges is of an ecosystem experiencing multiple changes around 50,000 years ago, with Homo floresiensis and Stegodon being the most prominent species to disappear from the record at roughly the same horizon. What this establishes is that the extinction of Homo floresiensis was not an isolated event affecting only one species. It was part of a broader ecological shift on the island. But what the volcanic and extinction record establishes first. Before we move to the question of cause, is something worth holding clearly. The lineage that went extinct around 50,000 years ago was not a fragile one. It was not a population at the edge of viability. One bad season away from collapse. It was a lineage with a demonstrated history of persisting through exactly the kinds of disruptions that would have ended a less resilient population long before. Tested repeatedly. Surviving repeatedly. As far as the record shows, that is why the final silence is so difficult to explain by appeal to any single familiar cause. Whatever ended a lineage that had survived everything, the record documents was sufficient to end something that had shown, again and again, that it knew how to endure. The known eruptions had not ended them. The familiar disruptions had not ended them. Something else, or some combination of pressures, did. Something that, as far as the record shows, had never been present on this island before. Chapter 7. 50,000 years ago, the silence begins. The sediments of Liang Bua Cave do not announce the ending. There is no single layer that says, here is where it stopped. No dramatic deposit of ash. No mass accumulation of remains, suggesting a sudden catastrophic event. The cave, which had been holding the record of hominin occupation in its layered sediments across a vast span of time, simply reaches a point above which the signs of their presence cease. Stone tools, faunal remains with cut marks, sediment layers bearing the traces of occupation, and then, above a certain level in the stratigraphy, none of those things. The silence is not loud. It is quiet in exactly the way that endings usually are. Not announced. Not dramatic. Simply the absence, where before there had been presence, of everything that marked their time in that place. Understanding what that silence means requires being precise about what the evidence actually says. Because the dating of the Homo floresiensis disappearance has been significantly revised since the original discovery, and the current state of knowledge is more nuanced than early reporting suggested. The original analysis of the Liang Bua deposits, published alongside the species description in 2004, suggested that the most recent Homo floresiensis remains dated to approximately 12,000 years ago. This figure entered the popular literature and was widely reported. It placed the species as a near contemporary of early agricultural societies and raised the striking possibility that Homo floresiensis might have survived long enough to have been encountered by the ancestors of people living on Flores. Today, that figure was revised. A comprehensive reanalysis of the Liang Bua stratigraphy and chronology, led by Matthew Tocheri of Lakehead University and Thomas Sutikna of the University of Wollongong, published in the journal Nature in 2016, produced a substantially different picture. The reanalysis found that the sediment layers had been disturbed and reworked in ways the original study had not fully accounted for. Material that had appeared to belong to a continuous sequence was in fact from different periods that had been mixed by geological processes within the cave. When the stratigraphy was properly resolved, the skeletal remains of Homo floresiensis were dated to approximately 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. The stone tools most securely attributed to Homo floresiensis occupation showed a terminal date of approximately 50,000 years before the present. The difference between 12,000 years and 50,000 years is not a minor correction. 50,000 years ago is a very different moment in the human story from 12,000 years ago. It is precisely the period during which Homo sapiens were expanding out of Africa and into the islands of Southeast Asia and toward Australia. It is the period when our ancestors were, for the first time, moving through the region of the world that includes Flores. The revised dating placed the Homo floresiensis extinction directly at the intersection of their existence and ours. Toheri, Sutikna, and their colleagues were careful in how they characterized this finding. The paper explicitly states that the cause of the extinction cannot be determined from the stratigraphic and chronological data alone. The correlation between the revised extinction date and the estimated timing of Homo sapiens' arrival in the region is real. But the authors are clear that correlation is not causation, and that multiple hypotheses remain viable candidates for what ended the Homo floresiensis lineage. This carefulness is not evasion. It is the appropriate scientific response to a situation where the evidence points toward a question without providing the answer. What the evidence does provide is a set of constraints that any satisfying explanation of the Homo floresiensis extinction has to work within. The first constraint is temporal. The extinction happened approximately 50,000 years ago. The timing is specific enough to be informative, even if not specific enough to identify a cause. The second constraint is the absence of a clear catastrophic event in the record at that specific horizon. Researchers examining the Liangbua stratigraphy around the 50,000-year mark have not identified a volcanic deposit of sufficient magnitude to explain the extinction at that precise time. Volcanic events are recorded in the sediments before and after the relevant period. But the extinction horizon itself does not coincide clearly with a major tephra layer of the kind that would be expected if a single eruption event was the primary cause. This does not rule out volcanic contributions, but it makes a simple volcanic explanation less compelling, particularly given the demonstrated resilience of the lineage across its prior history. The third constraint is the concurrent disappearance of stegodon. Whatever explanation is proposed for the Homo floresiensis extinction ideally needs to account for the stegodon disappearance as well, since both occur at roughly the same horizon. The fourth constraint is geographic. The extinction appears to have affected the entire island population. Whatever caused, it was not a local disruption that a group could escape by moving to an unaffected part of Flores. These constraints do not point toward a single answer. They point toward a problem space within which multiple hypotheses operate, each with supporting evidence, and each with questions it cannot fully answer. Consider what it means to be part of the Homo floresiensis population on Flores in the period just before the silence begins. Your lineage has been on this island for hundreds of thousands of years. The cave you shelter in has been a place of return for longer than any story your group carries can reach back to describe. The animals you share the island with, the routes you travel, the seasonal patterns you have learned to read. All of it is woven into the daily fabric of existence in ways so deep they feel less like knowledge and more like the structure of the world itself. And then something changes. Not the volcano, not the climate in the way the climate has always shifted. In rhythms, this lineage has navigated before. Something outside the range of what hundreds of thousands of years of island living had ever needed to account for. The evidence does not extend to the experience of that change from the inside. What it does is place the ending at a specific moment and surround that moment with a set of conditions that any honest account has to engage with directly. One of those conditions is the presence, somewhere in the regional environment, of another kind of human being, a kind that had never been to Flores before, a kind that nothing in the long history of this island had given anyone any preparation to understand. The question of what that presence meant is the question this story has been building toward. The cave holds it. 50,000 years of sediment, pressing down on the answer. Chapter 8. The Arrival Question. There is a map that exists only in the cumulative work of hundreds of researchers across several decades of genetic analysis. Radiocarbon dating. An archaeological survey. It is not printed in any single place. It has to be assembled from papers published in journals. From the ongoing revision of dates and interpretations that characterizes any field where the evidence is fragmentary and the questions are large. But the map is real. And what it shows, when you assemble it carefully and look at it honestly, is the movement of Homo sapiens out of Africa and across the world, traced in the DNA of living populations and the stone tools and bones left in sites from the Levant to Australia. The map shows our ancestors moving through Southeast Asia, and the timing of that movement is the fact that sits at the center of everything this chapter has to address. The earliest confirmed evidence of Homo sapiens in island Southeast Asia has been the subject of significant research and ongoing revision. For many years, the colonization of Australia was used as a proxy for the timing of Homo sapiens' movement through the region, on the reasonable assumption that reaching Australia required passing through island Southeast Asia first. A study published in Nature in 2017, led by Chris Clarkson of the University of Queensland, presented evidence from the site of Majid Bebe in northern Australia, suggesting human occupation dating to at least 65,000 years ago. This figure remains debated among researchers, with some arguing that the dating is robust and others questioning specific aspects of the methodology. The most widely accepted minimum date for human arrival in Australia currently sits in the range of 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, with ongoing research continuing to refine that estimate. If Homo sapiens were in Australia by 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, they were moving through island Southeast Asia before that. They were on the islands between the Asian mainland and Australia, navigating the same chain that includes Flores, at a time that overlaps directly with the revised date for the Homo floresiensis extinction. Research published in Nature in 2019 by Adam Brum and colleagues documented evidence of Homo sapiens rock art in Sulawesi, the large Indonesian island north of Flores, with dating suggesting a minimum age of at least 45,000 years for some of the imagery and potentially older for others. This finding established that Homo sapiens with a capacity for symbolic behavior were present in island Southeast Asia significantly earlier than previously confirmed. Sulawesi is not Flores, but it is within the same island chain, and its presence in this period strengthens the case that our species was active across the broader region during the time frame relevant to the Homo floresiensis question. The genetic evidence adds another dimension to this picture. Research on the ancient DNA of populations from Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians has found a small but detectable percentage of DNA from a source that is neither modern human nor Neanderthal nor Denisovan as currently defined. This signal has been discussed in the research literature as possibly reflecting contact with an additional archaic hominin population during the movement through Southeast Asia. Some researchers have raised the question of whether a population related to Homo floresiensis might be relevant to this signal. This hypothesis is speculative and not established. Most researchers working in this field do not currently attribute this signal specifically to Homo floresiensis. The direct evidence needed to test it, ancient DNA from Homo floresiensis themselves, has not been successfully recovered. The honest framing is that the hypothesis exists as a possibility in the scientific conversation, not as a conclusion, with supporting evidence. The evidence for Homo sapiens' presence specifically on Flores in the period around 50,000 years ago is less direct than the evidence for their presence elsewhere in the region. No Homo sapiens skeletal remains have been found in Flores deposits dating to this specific period. No stone tool assemblage on Flores has been definitively attributed to Homo sapiens in a context that clearly predates or is contemporaneous with the final Homo floresiensis occupation layers at Liang Bua. This absence is important to state clearly. It is the central evidentiary gap in the arrival question. We know Homo sapiens were moving through the region. We know that reaching Australia required island hopping through a chain that passes near Flores. We do not have direct physical evidence of Homo sapiens on Flores itself during the specific period of the Homo floresiensis extinction. What we have is a corridor. Researchers studying the paleogeography of island Southeast Asia have reconstructed the likely routes that Homo sapiens used to move from the Asian mainland toward Australia. A study published in Quaternary Science Reviews by researchers including Sue O'Connor of the Australian National University found that the Lesser Sunda route, passing through or near the island chain that includes Flores, was among the feasible pathways for the movement toward Australia, placing Flores within the geographic range of the movement rather than peripheral to it. The situation, stated as precisely as the evidence allows, is this: Homo sapiens were moving through the region of island Southeast Asia in the period around 50,000 years ago. The routes they used may have brought them into proximity with Flores. The Homo floresiensis population on Flores disappears from the archaeological record at approximately the same time. No direct evidence of Homo sapiens on Flores during this specific period has yet been found. The absence of that evidence does not confirm that Homo sapiens were not there. It confirms that we have not yet found evidence of their presence, if they were. These are not the same thing. The archaeological record of island Southeast Asia from this period is fragmentary. The region has not been as intensively surveyed as Europe or parts of Africa. The preservation conditions for organic materials in tropical environments are poor. Sites that would document the earliest Homo sapiens presence in this part of the world may exist and have not yet been found, or may have been destroyed by the same tropical conditions that have prevented the recovery of ancient DNA from Homo floresiensis. The pattern of species disappearances associated with Homo sapiens expansion across the globe is too consistent to dismiss. Even though the specific mechanism differs from case to case, and direct causation cannot be assumed in any single instance. Australia lost most of its megafauna in the period following human arrival. The Americas lost their megafauna at a similar juncture, in region after region. The arrival of our species is followed, in the stratigraphic record, by the disappearance of species that had been present before. The pattern does not require deliberate action in every case. It requires only the introduction of new pressures into ecosystems that had no prior experience of those specific pressures. Homo floresiensis had no prior experience of Homo sapiens. They had survived hundreds of thousands of years of isolation on an island they knew better than any other species alive. They had survived eruptions and ecological shifts. They had survived, again and again, everything the island had the capacity to produce, but they had never encountered another kind of human being. Not in their entire history on that island. Whatever challenges the island had thrown at them across that extraordinary span of time, another species of Homo was not among them. What that asymmetry of experience meant for the encounter, if the encounter occurred, is a question the evidence approaches from the outside without yet being able to answer from within. The timing is real. What the timing means is still being worked out. Chapter 9. The debate that will not close. Science is often described as a process of finding answers. That description is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Science is also a process of learning to ask better questions, of arriving, after years of careful work, not at a clean resolution, but at a more precise understanding of exactly what remains unresolved and why. The question of what ended Homo floresiensis is one of those questions. It has been asked since the species was first described in 2004. It has generated a substantial body of research. And after more than 2 decades of that attention, it remains genuinely open. Not because researchers have been careless, because the evidence is fragmentary. The question is large, and the honest answer involves acknowledging that multiple factors were probably operating in ways that are difficult to disentangle from the record currently available. Let the hypotheses speak in turn. Think about what a prolonged drought does to a tropical island. The forests thin. The rivers drop. The animals that depend on dense forest cover move or decline. The food sources that a small population has organized its survival around become less available, then scarcer, then unreliable in ways that no accumulated knowledge of past seasons can fully prepare for. This is the climate hypothesis for the Homo floresiensis extinction, and it has genuine support in the broader paleo-ecological record of this period. The time around 50,000 years ago was a period of significant global climate variability. The climate was oscillating between relatively warm and relatively cold intervals in ways that affected precipitation patterns and vegetation distribution across the tropics. For a small island ecosystem like Flores, climate-driven changes in rainfall could have consequences that moved through the entire food chain relatively quickly. The climate hypothesis has the advantage of potentially accounting for the concurrent disappearance of both Homo floresiensis and Stegodon. A sustained shift toward drier conditions could have reduced forest cover and Stegodon numbers simultaneously, placing increasing pressure on a population whose subsistence landscape was built around those animals. The difficulty is the survival record. Homo floresiensis had persisted through multiple prior intervals of climate variability across hundreds of thousands of years on the island. If climate was sufficient to end this lineage at this specific moment, something specifically severe about the conditions around 50,000 years ago on Flores needs to be identified, and that identification has not yet been made convincingly in the available evidence. Now think about what it feels like to stand at the base of a volcano when the ground begins to move. The second hypothesis involves volcanic activity. Flores is volcanically active, and it is always possible that an eruption event around 50,000 years ago was of sufficient scale to cause island-wide ecological disruption, severe enough to drive Homo floresiensis to extinction. A large enough eruption could have destroyed vegetation and prey populations simultaneously across an area too large for the population to escape by moving to unaffected parts of the island. This hypothesis faces the same fundamental problem. The stratigraphic record at Liang Bua does not show a major tephra deposit directly at the extinction horizon. Volcanic events are recorded in the sediments before and after the relevant period. But the specific moment of disappearance does not coincide clearly with a deposit large enough to have caused island-wide catastrophe. This does not rule out volcanic contributions to the broader stress of the period, but it makes a simple volcanic explanation less compelling, particularly given the demonstrated resilience of the lineage across its prior history. Now think about something that the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of thousands of years on one island had given no one any preparation to recognize. The third hypothesis involves new pressures associated with Homo sapiens' arrival in the region. This hypothesis does not require deliberate violence or systematic predation. It requires only that the presence of Homo sapiens in the regional environment introduced pressures that the Homo floresiensis population had no prior experience of and no established responses to. The mechanisms are multiple and not mutually exclusive. Direct competition for the same prey species would have increased pressure on Stegodon and other animals that the island's ecosystem had previously been supporting for one hominin population. A modest increase in processing pressure can, over years and decades, affect the reproductive success of a prey population in ways that compound gradually into significant decline. Indirect ecological disruption through burning of vegetation, modification of water source, or changes in animal movement patterns could have altered the Flores landscape in ways that affected Homo floresiensis, even without direct contact between the two species. Disease transmission is perhaps the most significant and most underappreciated mechanism. Homo sapiens, arriving from populations that had moved through diverse environments across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, would have carried pathogens reflecting all of those environments. Homo floresiensis, isolated on a single island for hundreds of thousands of years, would have had immune systems shaped only by the pathogens of Flores. The introduction of novel pathogens, to which they had no prior exposure, could have moved through a small, isolated population with effects that were rapid and severe. The difficulty with this hypothesis is the evidentiary gap identified in the previous chapter. We do not have direct evidence of Homo sapiens on Flores during the specific period of the Homo floresiensis extinction. The hypothesis rests on the correlation between the regional arrival timing and the extinction date, and on the broader pattern of species disappearances associated with Homo sapiens expansion elsewhere. The correlation is real. The pattern is consistent. But a correlation is not a mechanism. and the specific mechanism connecting Homo sapiens' arrival to Homo floresiensis. Extinction has not been documented directly in the Flores record. And then there is the fourth possibility, the one that feels least satisfying as a story, but may be closest to what actually happened. A combination: climate-driven stress reducing prey availability, ecological disruption from volcanic activity, new pressures introduced by the regional arrival of Homo sapiens at a moment when the population was already reduced and under stress. A lineage that had survived each of these factors individually might not have survived all of them, arriving together before the demographic and ecological recovery mechanisms had time to operate. Resilience has thresholds. A system that can absorb individual shocks may not absorb multiple shocks. Compounding faster than recovery is possible. This combination model is not satisfying in the way that a single clean cause would be satisfying, but it is consistent with how extinctions actually operate in ecological systems, where the proximate cause of a population's final collapse is rarely the only factor involved. Researchers who have written most carefully about the Homo floresiensis extinction, including Tocheri and Sutikna in the 2016 Nature paper, consistently characterize the cause as unknown and note that the available evidence is consistent with multiple hypotheses. The honest answer is that we do not know what ended Homo floresiensis. We know when, with reasonable precision. We know what the world around them looked like at that time. In fragmentary but meaningful detail, we know who else was in the regional environment, with enough confidence to ask the question directly. And the question remains open. 50,000 years old. Patient in the way that only unanswered questions can be patient, waiting for the work that might eventually bring it closer to an answer. We owe them that effort. Not because the answer will change what happened. What happened cannot be changed, but because the effort to understand it honestly is the only form of acknowledgement available to us across a distance of 50,000 years. Chapter 10. What it means to be the only one left. We are alone, not in the poetic sense, not in the existential sense that humans have reached for across centuries of philosophy and art, in a specific, biological, historical sense that the fossil record makes plain, and that we have largely stopped noticing because the aloneness has lasted so long, it feels like the natural condition of the world. It is not the natural condition of the world. For most of the time that human beings of any kind have existed on this earth, we were not alone. Other kinds of human beings shared the planet with our ancestors. Neanderthals, in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across parts of Asia, Homo floresiensis on Flores, and possibly others still being identified in fragmentary evidence from sites scattered across a world that has not yet given up all of its secrets. For tens of thousands of years, in some regions, two or more kinds of human being occupied the same landscapes, looked up at the same stars through minds that were similar enough to be recognizable and different enough to constitute something genuinely other. They are all gone now. We are the last. That transition from a world with multiple kinds of human being to a world with only one happened across a period that the fossil record is still working to document in full. For Neanderthals, the genetic evidence assembled through the work of researchers including Svante Pääbo of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, whose contributions to ancient genomics were recognized with the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022, has established that people of non-African ancestry carry Neanderthal DNA, on average somewhere between 1 and 2%, varying by population, with some groups carrying somewhat more. Something of the Neanderthals persists, molecularly, in billions of living people. The ending was not total. For Homo floresiensis, no equivalent genetic legacy has been confirmed. The ancient DNA that might reveal whether any exchange occurred between them and the Homo sapiens who moved through their region has not been successfully recovered from the Flores remains. The question of whether anything of them persists in living populations remains genuinely open, not answered in either direction. What Homo floresiensis forces into focus is something the genetic question alone cannot capture. They were maximally isolated, a small population on one island, cut off from the broader networks of exchange and contact that linked other archaic hominin populations to the expanding Homo sapiens world. And they were maximally specific. The knowledge they carried, the understanding of Flores accumulated across hundreds of thousands of years of dependence on that island, existed in its full form only in the minds of the individuals who made up the Homo floresiensis population at any given time. When that population ended, all of it ended with them. Not just the individuals, the entire accumulated understanding of one specific island, built up across a span of time that makes all of recorded human history look like a single afternoon. The knowledge of where water could be found in a dry season. The knowledge of how the animals of Flores moved through the valleys in different months. The knowledge of the caves, the rivers, the volcanic patterns, the rhythms of a landscape that no other mind had known for as long or as deeply. Gone. Completely. Without remainder. We are the ones who are left. We are also the ones doing the excavating. The ones with the brushes and the radiocarbon dating equipment and the ancient DNA laboratories. The ones who found LB1 in the sediment of that cave and recognized it for what it was. The ones who revised the dating when the original analysis was found to be incomplete. Even though the revision made the question of our own species' role in the extinction harder to avoid. There is something worth noticing in that. We did not have to look. The caves of Flores are not in a region of the world where archaeological fieldwork has historically been well-funded or intensively pursued. The discovery of Homo floresiensis happened because researchers chose to go there. Chose to dig carefully. Chose to take seriously what the bones were telling them, even when what the bones were telling them was inconvenient to received understanding. That choice, repeated across 2 decades of fieldwork and analysis, is its own kind of acknowledgement. Not absolution. Not resolution. Just the refusal to let the silence be the final word. The insistence on asking the question even when the answer is uncomfortable and incomplete. We are a species capable of moving through the world in ways that alter it profoundly. Sometimes without intending to. Sometimes without knowing the full consequences until the evidence surfaces thousands of years later in the sediment of a limestone cave. We are also a species capable of going back to look, of applying our finest instruments to the recovery of even fragmentary traces of what was lost, of caring, across a distance of 50,000 years, whether another kind of mind existed, and what it was capable of, and what it meant that it is gone. Both of those things are true about us. The question of which one we choose to act on is not a question about the past. It is a question about now. Chapter 11. The cave is still there. Go to Flores. Not tonight. Not in any literal sense that the dark and the quiet of wherever you are would permit, but follow the thought there. Because this is where the story ends, and it is worth ending in a specific place rather than in the abstraction where accounts of deep prehistory tend to dissolve if you let them. The island of Flores is still there. It has not gone anywhere. The volcanic arc that produced it is still active, still building and reshaping the landscape through the same geological processes that were operating when the first hominin population arrived on its shores close to 1 million years ago. The mountains that rise above the Manggarai region in the western part of the island are still steep and forested. The Wei Rakang River still runs through the valley below the limestone hills where Liang Bua Cave opens into the hillside. The cave is still there. The chamber that Homo floresiensis sheltered in, the floor that holds the layered record of their occupation across hundreds of thousands of years of returning to this specific place, is still there. Researchers have been working in it for more than 2 decades since the 2003 excavation season that produced LB1. Each season of careful work adds to what the cave has offered. Each new analysis of material already recovered refines the picture. The work is slow and meticulous, and it is not finished. New individuals have been identified in the years since the original discovery. Fragments and bones that extend the demographic picture of the population that used this cave. A child. Multiple adults. Individuals whose remains span a substantial period of time, suggesting that Liang Bua was not a single episode site, but a place that generations returned to across the long arc of their existence on the island. In 2016, the same year the revised chronology was published, a paper in Nature reported the discovery of hominin remains from the site of Mata Menge in the Soa Basin of Flores, approximately 70 kilometers east of Liang Bua. These fragmentary dental and jaw remains, described by Gerrit van den Berg and colleagues, dated to approximately 700,000 years ago and showed characteristics consistent with small body size, pushing back the timeline of the size reduction process significantly and deepening the story of how long this lineage had been becoming what it was. The tools at Wolo Sege, dated to approximately 1 million years ago, push the beginning of the story back further still. 3 sites, 3 windows into different moments of a story that lasted longer than our entire species has existed. And each new field season has the potential to open another window, or to change what the existing ones show us. The ancient DNA question remains open. The tropical conditions that have prevented successful extraction of genetic material from the Liang Bua specimens have not improved. But the techniques for ancient DNA recovery have continued to advance since the initial attempts. The technical threshold for what counts as sufficient preservation has been lowered by advances in methodology. And the attempt continues. If ancient DNA from Homo floresiensis is ever successfully recovered and sequenced, the implications for understanding their relationship to modern human populations would be significant. The question of whether any genetic exchange occurred between them and the Homo sapiens who moved through their region would have a direct answer rather than a speculative one. That answer may be waiting in the bones. Whether the bones will yield it is a question that patience and technology will eventually resolve, or will not. In the villages near Liang Bua, the local Manggarai people have oral traditions about small people who lived in the forests and hills of Flores. These traditions, collected by researchers, including Gregory Forth of the University of Alberta, and described in his book, published by Columbia University Press, refer to beings called Ebu Gogo, described as small, cave-dwelling, capable of repeating words spoken to them. The relationship between these traditions and Homo floresiensis is carefully debated. Forth himself argues that folklore traditions about small, non-human beings are widespread across human cultures, and that the characteristics of the Ebu Gogo reflect a complex cultural history for the stories rather than a straightforward account of encounters with actual small-bodied hominins. Other researchers consider the traditions worth taking seriously as possible echoes of something real. We do not know. One more layer of the Flores puzzle. One more piece of evidence pointing toward a question without providing the answer. Now consider what it means that Liang Bua Cave is still being excavated. That researchers are still going there, season after season, with trowels and brushes and the patience that the slow recovery of the past requires, that the bones and the tools and the sediment that accumulated across hundreds of thousands of years of occupation are still being read, layer by layer, year by year, by people who have dedicated their working lives to understanding what happened on that island. The work is an act of attention, of the specific kind of attention that we pay to things we have decided matter. One is still there. In the museum collections and the laboratory analyses and the published descriptions that have made this existence known to a world that otherwise would never have known it existed at all. The adult whose worn teeth and fused growth plates told Peter Brown that this was a person, fully grown, fully lived, whose brain was the size of a closed fist, and whose life was complete in ways the sediment of that cave had been holding for tens of thousands of years. They did not leave monuments. They did not leave writing. They did not leave the kind of durable cultural record that allows us to know what they believed or what stories they told about themselves and the island they lived on. What they left is smaller than any of those things. And, in its own way, more honest. They left bones in a cave that held them for 50,000 years. They left tools, shaped from stone, carried from sources miles away. They left the faint, careful, debated traces of a presence so long and so specific that the island itself, if islands could be said to hold anything, held the shape of them. They left a question, and we are still trying to answer it. The cave above the river valley in western Flores is quiet now, in the way that limestone caves are always quiet. Not empty, quiet, full of the slow accumulation of what the past has left behind, waiting for the right instruments and the right questions to make it speak. Somewhere in those sediments, in the layers not yet excavated, there may be evidence that changes what we know, evidence that resolves the debate about what ended them, evidence that tells us more about what their daily life looked like in that cave and in the landscape surrounding it. Or there may not be. The cave does not promise anything. But the small people of Flores, who made tools and processed animals and came back to that cave again and again across a span of time the mind cannot fully hold, who lived fully and specifically in a world that was entirely their own before it was gone, who stood in the mouth of that cave in the early morning and looked out at the forested hills and the river below and the volcanic sky above, through minds that hundreds of thousands of years of one island had made into something the world had never seen before. They deserve the patience of our attention. They deserve the honesty of our uncertainty. And they deserve, at minimum, this, the acknowledgement that they were here, for hundreds of thousands of years. As far as the record shows, they were here, and somewhere between here and sleep tonight, if you let it. That thought will stay with you, not as a fact about an ancient creature, as a fact about a person, about many persons, about a lineage of persons who looked out at the same night sky you are under right now, through minds shaped by one island across a span of time that makes all of human history look like a single quiet evening. They were here. Sleep well. Good night.